You know what the world needs right now more than anything? It's just to hear a good old-fashioned fish tale. And man, do I got one for you today. It's about a big one. And it didn't get away, not to fish. Oh, we got to fish. The big one that got away? Well, let's go on up here in the potential Bigfoot Sasquatch forest and let me tell you about that one. Whew. Comes now a reading from the Files of Bigfoot Sasquatch, Volume 5. A story called The One That Got Away. It's a story for a friend. Mama thinks we should go camping together to get to know each other better before the semester starts. It was JR, my roommate for the upcoming fall semester in college. Rather, as I viewed it at the time, my lackey, and I his liege. JR was the kid brother of a girl I'd gone to high school with. She was a year behind me, and despite the fact that she was absolutely gorgeous, we'd never been anything more than friends. But not just friends, as people might say in defense when accused of there being more to it than that, but good friends. You see, we both ran track, and we were both awesome at it, and we were both obsessed with the sport. Sure, when people saw us together at the meets or sitting together on the bus on the way to or from the meets, or hanging out together at lunch in school, they'd make their accusations. But even then, they knew the truth. When JR's sister was a junior and I a senior, JR was still in middle school. My only memories of him before our camping trip and the school year that would follow was of a near snot-nosed little kid who always sat between his mother and father at track meets and who never said a word. I tried talking to him just to be polite and respectful when I'd see him at the meets, but he never had anything to say. Literally, I mean, he wouldn't even speak back. "Is your brother dim?" I'd asked his sister once at a track meet. "No," she'd said. "He just hasn't come out of his shell yet." "Sure," I said on the phone. This was back when there was nothing but landlines. "Let's go camping. It'll be fun." Oh, God, is what I really thought. This is just going to be boring as crap. The semester started at the end of August, only 3 weeks from the time I received JR's call. It was early August and hot as hell in Appalachia. We decided we'd go camping at one of the few places public camping was allowed in our region. Like most third world provinces, the government owned most of the land in our area. In this case, the United States Department of the Interior was our lord, as our entire province, outside of a few small municipalities, was designated national forest. Our campground of choice was made up of a dozen or so tent sites. Each site provided a large wooden picnic table, a metal fire ring for a campfire, and a grill which was cemented into the ground so none of the local rabble could steal it and take it back to their mobile homes. There was a wooden box with envelopes at the gate of the campground, which was never locked, and you simply stuck 3 $1 bills in the envelope, wrote your campsite number on the envelope, and dropped it in the box. The park ranger would come by each evening at dark and get the money. If you forgot or if you were trying to squat for a night, he'd usually just let you. No one gives a crap in Appalachia. Like any third world country, it's why the region is nearly third world poor. Apathy. I was 22 years old at the time and going into my 6th and what would finally turn out to be my last year in college. Sure, it was taking me a little longer than most to graduate because I worked almost full time almost every year I was in college. But I also have to admit that like any good college student, I had a tendency to party balls at night and miss those early morning classes the next day. It didn't really matter much because I'd make sure to show up for class a day or two before any tests, and I'd ace the tests. But what I would find out is that the intellectual elitist types who were known as professors considered it an insult that some hillbilly kid from Appalachia could party balls, entertain all the pretty college girls they all had their sick fantasies about, never go to class, and then show up on test days and get A's. They would eventually start kicking me out of their classes for excessive absences, thereby giving me a grade of F for the course, shattering my GPA. But despite this, I would still go on to graduate, barely, and continue to succeed in the real world, which they claimed to know so much about, yet spent no real time in. And I continued to entertain the ladies of which they could only fantasize. Nah, boo-boo, B-words. Remembering JR as a not on a log, I made sure to get a case of beer for our camping trip. Sure, it was only going to be a one-nighter, but one night can be a very long time when you're stuck with someone who carries on a conversation with only a few words. Those words being uh-huh, yup, and oh. I figured a few cold ones, or a dozen, would get me through it. I was sure JR didn't even drink, so I was confident I wouldn't run out. I was spending the summer at my apartment where JR and I would live during the upcoming school year, so I drove into our crap-hole Appalachian American town and picked him up and his supplies up and headed up to our campground. As fate would have it, his big sister, my old friend, was visiting their parents, so I got to see her for the first time in several years. I'll say two things here. As a young man who was no longer obsessed with track and field, I certainly saw her through different eyes. She was absolutely drop-dead gorgeous, as she'd always been, and I began mentally kicking myself in the ass for never having pushed the envelope a little more in regard to my relationship with her all those years ago. The insult to go with the injury was that she had her fiancé with her. He was a recent accounting grad who'd landed a gig with a large investment firm, and he looked like a Ken doll. I took the high road and I wished him the best, but that old Billy Ray Cyrus song, It Could Have Been Me, which was new at the time, was blaring inside my head. Oh well. JR and I drove to our campsite in half silence. I call it half silence because I talked, but he didn't, except for the occasional uh-huh, yup, or oh. The hour-long drive felt like a day, but alas, we finally reached our destination. We put our $3 in a little envelope at the front gate, took the campsite furthest back, which would end up being the closest to the approximately 5 acres lake, only a 100-yard hike through the woods, and we set up our tent. After doing so, I cracked open a can of Stroh's. Hey, it was Appalachistan, and offered one to JR. No thanks, he said, and I considered it a small victory to have gotten 2 new words out of him. After I had a couple of brewskis, we decided we'd grab our fishing poles and walk to the lake and go fishing. I knew our efforts would be futile because of the heat. Here it was, early August, and it had to be every bit of 98 degrees. The humidity was so high that our clothes were sticking to us. We'd taken off our shirts, only to find that the local mosquitoes found us quite tasty, so we'd put them back on just as quickly as we'd shedded them for at least a slight layer of protection. There were no other campers at the campground because despite the local populace being referred to as dumb hillbillies by those who lived outside of the semi-autonomous, culturally and economically wise region of Appalachistan, they'd had enough sense to stay inside where there was air conditioning or fans. There was simply no way any cold-blooded animal, like fish, was going to move on a day like this. You'd have to get lucky enough to cast your bait into its open mouth while it was breathing. Sure enough, as I'd suspected, the fish weren't biting. JR and I stood on the lonely dock of the lake, heat waves glistening in every direction, throwing cast after cast to no avail. The more we cast, the more we sweat, and what little bit of noticeable effect I'd gotten off my 2 cans of Stroh's was now gone. Just as I was about to recommend we head back to the campsite and wait until evening, when the temperatures would be cooler and we might have a better chance of actually catching something, which was really my well-thought-out excuse for heading back to drink more beer, we heard what sounded like a broken airplane coming up the mountain. Not by way of air, but on the road. "What in the hell is that?" I said, turning to look behind us. "Huh?" JR said, the only word in his vocabulary which would be fitting. "Do you hear that?" I said. "Uh-huh," he said, turning to face the same direction as I was. A few minutes later, we saw it. The golden calf, pulling into the driveway behind us and heading straight toward us. The stock truck. For those hearing this, listening to this, who don't know what the stock truck is, it's the truck owned and operated by the local fish hatcheries that carries large tanks of highly oxygenated water on the back, and those highly oxygenated tanks of water are filled with fish, in this case, trout. Now, here's something that even most people who understand all this might not understand. At this time of year, the tail end of the dog days of summer, those stock trucks carry what's called breeders. These are the absolutely oldest fish from the hatcheries that they'd used for egg laying and fertilizing for many years, and which are probably only months away from dying due to old age. The hatcheries tend to do the humane thing by releasing them into the wild so they can spend their final months living like real fish. Translation? These fish are freaking huge. Ginormous, as in Ginormica enormica. JR and I reeled our lines in and watched in awe as the two men operating the truck pulled right up to the water's edge, got out, took two big nets on long poles off the side of the truck, climbed onto the top of the truck, opened the water tanks, and began scooping up the largest trout either of us had ever seen in our lives and tossing them into the lake. It was as if every other fish they threw into the water was a full 3 feet long, and every other one was pretty damn close to it. "Holy cow," JR said, barely audible, but he'd said it. I didn't know which amazed me more at the time, the size of the trout being stalked into the lake right before our eyes, or that there were other words in JR's vocabulary. After throwing in what seemed like an endless amount of netted fish, the two men closed the lids to the tanks and then climbed down off the top of the truck. They hooked their nets back to the side of the stock truck. The man riding shotgun jumped in the truck and buckled up, and the driver, just before getting in, looked at us, smiled big, and said, "Have fun, boys." And boy, did we. We watched the stock truck drive off and out of sight, and we were blinking over and over as if to make sure the sight was really real, not some sort of Appalachian mirage. And as soon as the truck was gone, and after we could no longer hear the rumbling of its engine heading down the mountain, we turned around and cast our baits into the lake. "Son of a bitch," JR screamed, having hooked into a trout the second his bait hit the water. We were using salmon eggs, like red balls, little red balls that may or may not have actually been salmon eggs. But they smelled like fish, and they actually worked. And boy, did they work on this hot August afternoon. Well, really bad word, he screamed here as he worked his reel, which was screeching insanely as the giant fish on the other end of the line pulled out more line, despite JR's best efforts. You could tell the kid was a pretty regular fisherman because he reached down and tightened his drag, just enough to where the giant trout he had on the line could fight without snapping the line. The mistake many anglers make is that they set the drag too tight and the big fish merely snap the line. JR did not make this mistake. It took nearly 10 minutes, and I halfway thought JR was prolonging the fight to be melodramatic, but when he finally landed the fish, I was able to see that the whole thing had been legit. He pulled in a ginormous brown trout, the likes of which I'd never seen. We measured it, and the thing, from tip of the snout to the end of its tail, was 38 inches in length. It had to have weighed 15 pounds. I had never seen a trout that big in my life, and neither had JR, nor have I since. "Dad's gonna crap his pants when he sees this," JR said. I couldn't believe what I'd heard. This young man actually did understand and speak the English language. His vocabulary was made up of more than 3 simple words and/or grunts. I was witnessing magic happening. I cast my line into the water, and sure enough, as soon as my bait hit, a mouth the likes of which I'd never seen on a trout came up and took my bait, and the fish attached to the mouth began heading out into the middle of the lake. I set the hook and tried to reel, and alas, my drag had been set too tightly, and snap! My line broke, and the big one, at least my big one, got away. JR and I fished only another 15 minutes longer because that's all the time it took for us to both catch our limit of 6 trout each. We had between us a dozen trout, and the smallest of our catch was 18 inches long. The largest, of course, was JR's monster of a brown trout. "Let's go fry these some bitches up and drink some beer," JR said, and I felt like I was hanging out with a different guy than I'd come up to camp with. JR and I made our way through the trail back to the campsite, and we did just as he'd recommended. Before we even lit a fire in the grill, we opened up a can of Stroh's each, we toasted our miraculous trout fishing success, and then we began to drink. And we drank like thirsty men lost in the desert for days with no water. But our water had hops and yeast and barley. And these ingredients had been allowed to ferment, and the results had been cold filtered. And we did drink of the results of this fine, refining process. And we did become drunk upon the alcohol because it was in excess. And at some point, we actually cooked some fish and ate them too. JR and I partied into the night. I found out so much about JR. He actually had a girlfriend. They'd actually known each other in the biblical sense, though I had to swear not to tell his sister because she might tell their mom. I confided in JR that I regretted not taking my relationship with his smoking hot sister to another level. and he confided in me that he thought that was gross and that if I had, he might have had to whoop me. I kept it to myself that I didn't think he could because we were drunk upon the alcohol that had been in excess, after all. And when you get two hillbillies in Appalachistan drunk on alcohol wearing excess, best good buddies and future roommates and all, or not, you're most likely to get a fist fight than you're not. And then we passed the letter F word out just before the sun came up. Do you hear that? It was JR. He started by pushing me in the head to wake me up. I was still drunk. I looked at my watch and saw that it was just a little after 7 a.m. We'd slept maybe 2 hours at best. Hear what? I mumbled. But JR didn't need to answer, for just as I said it, I did hear it. It sounded as if someone or something was opening our cooler outside. My fish, JR said, jumping up to his knees, then falling over, because he was obviously still drunk too. And then he jumped back up to his knees and made his way to the tent's door and unzipped it. He stuck his head out and yelled, "Yo, ah, yeah!" Appalachian American, by the way, for get on out of here. I rose to my knees, slowly, and joined him at the tent's door. I looked out and saw what had to have been the biggest black bear I'd ever seen in my life. The thing had to weigh nearly 400 pounds. If it were to stand on its hind legs, it would have had to have been nearly 7 feet tall. The bear had just knocked the lid off our cooler. JR yelled again. Are you effing crazy? I said to JR, but I didn't. I said the real word. And in not much more than a whisper, my fish, he said. The day and night before, when we'd fried up our trout and eaten it, we did not fry up JR's giant brown. We didn't even cut its head off or gut it. We'd put it on ice for 2 reasons. Number 1, he wanted to show his father because he wanted him to be proud of him. This is something Appalachian American males spend their lifetimes doing, trying to make their fathers proud of them, though few, if any, ever achieve this, because their fathers' fathers had never shown any pride in them, so it had not been a learned trait. And secondly, he wanted to have it officially weighed and measured, for we both thought it might have been a new state record. We watched out the tent door as JR's worst fears came true. The giant bear took the giant brown trout up in its mouth and simply sauntered out into the woods, no doubt taking it off somewhere more private to devour it. Come on, JR said, and we jumped out of the tent and scooped up a handful of rocks. He began following the bear, pelting it with rocks and cursing its mother's maiden name. Are you effing crazy? I said, crawling out of the tent and picking up a handful of rocks myself. Since I was still drunk and not thinking too clearly, I began pelting the big black bear with rocks as well. I figured since JR was cursing its mother's maiden name, I'd say a few derogatory things about its father. We followed the bear about 100 yards down a different trail than the one that led to the lake. This one led in the opposite direction, deeper into the woods on the other side of our campsite. At this point, the bear looked back at us, as if just now noticing us. We saw the giant brown trout in its mouth. So far it had not been damaged. There may have been hope after all. The bear turned back to face the direction in which it had been heading, and then it moved further down the trail, deeper into the forest. We scooped up more rocks and continued to follow the bear. We had reverted to cursing its siblings and offspring, since cursing its parents had no effect. 400 yards into the woods now, and we were about to give up all hope, but then that's when it happened. An event that I will remember until my dying day. At first, we thought the bear had had enough. It turned and looked at us, and we saw its eyes grow even larger than they were. The bear stood up on its hind legs, and just as I'd suspected, it was every bit of 7 feet tall. It opened its mouth, we thought to let out a mighty roar, but it made not a sound. We watched as the giant brown trout dropped from its mouth, still undamaged, and fell to the forest floor. And then we heard the roar, but it came not from the bear. The mighty roar came from behind and above us. We turned and looked upward, expecting to see a mountain lion in a tree. Allegedly, the last mountain lion seen in our part of Appalachistan officially had been back during the Civil War, when our state had split from the much more prosperous state of Virginia. It had been shot and killed by a guard in a nearby Union prison camp which held Confederate POWs. but rumors were always circulating about these giant cats being around, though in very small numbers. However, what we saw sitting on the sizable limb of a giant oak tree was not a mountain lion. It was something even more rare. It was something that was not supposed to exist at all. It was Bigfoot Sasquatch. We could hear the bear behind us taking off at full speed on all fours. It obviously wasn't even trying to miss running into the small saplings and seedlings and even some trees of considerable size that stood in its way. It merely ran through them, leaving a trail of destruction that looked very much like a small tornado had ripped through the area. JR and I watched in both fear and disbelief as the Bigfoot Sasquatch, with only one leap, jumped to a limb every bit of 20 feet away and then dropped to the ground, its back toward us, and then reached down and picked up the giant brown trout. It turned slowly to face us. We thought the bear had been amazingly tall, but this creature was taller by at least a foot. We thought the bear's shoulders had been broad, and they had been, but the shoulders of this creature were broader. As we continued to look in disbelief, the giant Bigfoot Sasquatch raised the giant brown trout to its mouth, making it look like a sardine in comparison to itself, and then in one bite, a small bite, as if to see if it was even worth eating, the Bigfoot Sasquatch bit the entire head off of the giant brown trout. It chewed once, twice, 3 times, and then swallowed. For an instant, I could have sworn I'd seen a smile of approval, and then in only 2 giant hungry bites, it ate the rest of the fish. Then, as if we weren't even there, it turned and merely walked slowly down the trail the bear had been traveling. We watched as within a matter of mere seconds, it rounded the turn and disappeared into the forest's thick underbrush of mostly mountain laurel and scrag oak. JR and I returned to our tent and attempted to sleep off our drunk. But after what we'd just seen, sleep eluded us. We waited until late afternoon that day so that our drunks would at least have time to wear off, and then we packed our stuff and headed off the mountain. I took JR back to his parents' house before heading back to what would soon be our shared apartment just off campus of our little hick college. Unfortunately, his sister had already left, so I didn't get to say goodbye to her again. We told JR's parents about the great fishing success we had, and we told them of JR's giant brown trout. We told of how we ate all the fish except that one, and of how a giant black bear took it from our cooler that morning and carried it off into the woods. We ended our story there, daring not to run the risk of being committed to the local lunatic asylum for telling of the events that took place after that. After we told our fishing story, JR's parents looked at us intently for a full 10 seconds, and then, in unison, they began laughing their asses off. "Yeah, right," his mother said. "Did you guys practice that story the whole way home?" "Yeah," his father said. "If you're going to tell a whopper like that, why not go for broke?" JR and I looked at each other in disbelief. How could they not believe this story? It was certainly more believable than the truth. "Why not say," his father continued, "that a damn Bigfoot Sasquatch took your fish?" With that, JR's parents laughed even more hysterically until they saw the look that JR and I exchanged. And then they stopped laughing. JR and I would go on to live for an entire school year together. We had our ups and downs, as roommates will have, but there were far more ups and downs. We partied balls in our apartment, we partied balls at the college football games, and we partied balls at the bars. We played musical beds with many a fair lady, and we commiserated, enduring many a hangover together, but through it all, we were friends. Sadly, like so many of my friends from my youth, JR and I ended up losing touch with each other. You see, we only spent 1 year together as roommates, because that would indeed be my last year of school. I graduated and left Appalachistan because I wanted something more out of life than digging coal or stacking lumber. Not that there's anything wrong with either profession. They are admirable and they are necessary, but neither are for me. I went back to the motherland of Virginia, and I would move on to other places from time to time, the West Coast, the Middle East, Asia, then eventually back to the motherland, but I never did reconnect with JR. And then, sadly, and just recently, I got news that he'd passed away too early. JR never escaped Appalachistan. He didn't manage to graduate from college, and he ended up in the mines, like his father before him, and like his father's fathers for countless generations before that. JR had married a beautiful young woman, and they'd enjoyed several children together. And then JR was killed in a motorcycle accident one night while on his way home from the mines. He was 41 years old. We've all heard stories of the one that got away. Who or what was the one that got away in this story? Was it JR's smoking hot sister? Was it the giant trout that snapped my line in the lake that day? A trout that I'm still convinced was larger than the one that JR caught? Was it the giant Bigfoot Sasquatch that we saw eat JR's giant brown trout? And the opportunity to snap a picture of him, her, it, or it, there's only one, and have the undeniable evidence that researchers have been looking for decades? It was none of these. It was JR. When we find a true friend in life, one who accepts us despite our faults, our flaws, our shortcomings, our human errors, our personal character defects, someone who loves us and approves of us in spite of ourselves, we should cherish them, nurture the friendship, and by all means never let them go. Stay in touch, because friends like that, well, they are rare. They are more rare than the beauty of certain women. They are more rare than the giant fish raised in hatcheries and released into the wild in their final months of living. And they are more rare than the elusive cryptids that I'm convinced roam the world around us, rarely seen as they may be. JR was one of those friends, and he was my friend. I miss you, JR, and I love you. The end.